Thank you, Ruth. I have the extraordinary opportunity to work with incredible colleagues across Google and Google DeepMind on some of the most foundational research questions and frontier questions in AI, computing, and science. And it's a wonderful opportunity today to be in conversation with two of my colleagues. It's one of those fun things I get to do, which is I get to work with these extraordinary colleagues on these fundamental questions. And these two colleagues, Michel Devoret and John Jumper, in some ways have worked on some of the most foundational questions in science. One which is the quantum reality of nature, the other is the building blocks of life. And their work was extraordinarily acknowledged and rewarded with their Nobel Prize that they got. But these are still working colleagues. They're still deep in the research. They're still involved in the work that we do. So what we're going to try to do today is have a brief conversation here on stage. And we're going to try to bridge two worlds. On the one hand, how we understand the quantum reality of nature and the work that Michel did and his colleagues who got the Nobel Prize with him. And then on the other hand, again, the building blocks of life through the work that John did. Let me say something briefly about Michel's work. Before the experiments that he got the Nobel Prize for, together with other colleagues, they did these experiments in the 80s. People understood quantum reality to be, quantum mechanics to basically operate at the very microscopic level, at the level of atoms and the standard particles in standard physics, fermions, electrons, and all those kinds of things. But nobody thought that you could actually see these effects, these quantum effects, at the macroscopic scale. And that's the work that John Martinez, John Clark, and Michel Devoret did to actually make some breakthroughs in that they actually showed that you could actually see quantum effects and be able to work with them at the macroscopic level by building these quantum macroscopic circuits. That's the work that they did. In the case of John, you've seen it on the video, 50-year grand challenge trying to understand proteins, which are in some ways one of the fundamental aspects of biology and life itself. And of course, they predicted the structure of all the 200 million proteins that were known to science. But I think what's extraordinary about what they did was opening up the protein database to being able to be accessed and used by now, I think it's over 3.5 million scientists around the world in over 190 countries who are working on a wide range of things to help us make progress. So these are such extraordinary, I think, achievements. And I think what's also interesting about them is what they open up, what worlds they open up. These are, because of the fundamental nature of these advances, they open up so many other applications, so many other uses, and we'll get into some of that a bit. So allow me to welcome my colleagues, Michel Devoret and John Jumper. Please join me on the stage. Fantastic. Well, we get to do on stage what we normally do when we're working together, but we'll try to make it interesting for everybody. Let me start with you. I mean, I think you've both had sort of interesting journeys to the breakthroughs that you've done. I'll start with you, Michel. I mean, when you were doing these experiments in the 80s, actually with your old PhD advisor, John Clark, and your colleague, John Martinez, and I think you were trying to do these experiments.
John Clark was my postdoc advisor.
Oh, he was, but he was, I think it was John Martinez's PhD advisor.
Yes.
But he was your postdoc advisor, that's correct. And this is at University of Berkeley, UC Berkeley. And when you were doing these experiments, I think what you're trying to do, you're doing exploratory research to try to understand these quantum effects at a macroscopic scale. And I think this built on the work, I think was Sir Tony Leggett, who had done, who'd proposed an experiment that could try to illustrate these effects. Can you talk a little bit about what that exploratory research was about, and also maybe say something about the actual breakthroughs that you made? Because there were actually two different breakthroughs. One was the quantum tunneling, and the other was the kind of the quantization effect that you were able to show. So talk a little bit about that journey and what you were trying to explore in your research.
Yes, so one has to go back to the spirit of the 70s and 80s, where quantum mechanics was triumphant in many areas of natural sciences where, you know, the transistor, the laser had been invented. Those are manifestations of quantum mechanics, but only at the microscopic scale. And so there was this new question that the late Tony Leggett presented. Unfortunately, Tony died a few weeks ago. But he had this vision that there was absolutely no evidence, in fact, in all this progress of quantum mechanics, that it would apply at the macroscopic world, in particular for quantum electrical, for electrical circuits that were so important in everyday chips, for instance. And he was responsible for this quest. He was a doubter. He was doubting the validity of quantum mechanics on the microscopic scale for very good reasons, namely the fact that the principles of quantum mechanics have inside them a contradiction. There are two principles, the Schrödinger equation and the Born postulates, that actually are incompatible with each other. This is not new in science. Newton actually, in his theory of gravitation, recognized that there was deeply in his theory a contradiction also, which was resolved by Einstein more than 2 centuries afterwards. But this was the driving force in this exploratory research, and the fantastic arc of you know, the work done by us, but by many in our community, was to actually go from this exploratory research and make it into an industry, an industrial realization.
And at the time when you were doing this, Michel, did you have a sense that this was going to be the foundations of a new kind of computing? Or were you simply just trying to understand the...
Okay, so this is a very good, a very interesting question, because whereas we felt right away that our discovery was actually linking us to the field of atomic physics that you know, had produced atomic clocks and the lasers, we perceived that we were founding a new type of atomic physics in which you could actually attach wires to atoms. And that was going to be important for atomic physics, but we did not anticipate quantum computing. You see, in fact, this came in the middle of the 90s. Before that, people were dreaming about quantum computers as the ultimate miniaturization of computers, but all they were trying to do was to prove that a computer reduced to elementary particles would work just as well as a macroscopic computer. So it was more in the idea of, well, where can we go in miniaturization? How far can we go? No one expected before the mid-90s that actually a quantum computer could accomplish something much more powerful than a classical computer. That was the revolution of the 90s, and then a lot of us physicists relabeled their research on quantum effects as research on quantum
computing.
Yes.
Then we got to Shor's algorithm and Grover's algorithm. But let me turn to you, John. You know, you and I have talked about this, and you've described yourself as an accidental chemist. And in fact, you know, there's a fun story, which is, I know it's not quite right, which is, you know, you dropped out of physics, a PhD in physics.
I did drop out of a PhD. That part is very right.
Right, but and now you get a Nobel Prize in chemistry. But talk a little bit about the journey, how you eventually got to DeepMind, and also the realization that in fact biology, at least a part of the biology you're working on, is fundamentally a physics problem.
I mean, I kind of grew up loving physics, and I don't remember exactly when it started, but I loved this notion that, you know, some of us on the third rock from the sun can learn the secrets of the universe, and I love this extraordinary, you know, the 20th century was really a century of extraordinary physics discovery. I love and still love physics and physicists, and I did a physics math undergrad, and it was wonderful. And then I went to do a physics PhD, and I kind of ended up in something that didn't quite grab me, and a wonderful advisor, but it wasn't for me, so I dropped out. And I was an unemployed physicist, so I applied for quantitative finance jobs, as one does. And I figured I would work for a year or two in quant finance, and then I would go back and do a physics PhD. But I happened to land at a place, D.E. Shaw Research, which people will recognize the first half of the name, but worked on building custom computer chips to study how proteins move. And I knew nothing about biology, but it just immediately grabbed me. These were people saying, let us do math, let us do computing, and if we do it right, somebody with lung cancer will get treated. It's Ruth's extraordinary story and extraordinary emotional story. That is why we do biological research. Is it unlocks the secrets of us so that people go home from the hospital. And I just dearly loved this, and I worked there for 3 years, and it was beautiful. And I said, okay, I should become a real scientist. I should get my PhD. And ended up, actually missed the deadline to apply to a physics grad school. And like 2 months later, I was telling a colleague, and I said, I don't know what I'm going to do, because my wife has this great offer at Chicago Genetics. And he goes, well, do you think you could be a chemist? And I hadn't taken a chemistry class since high school, but I figured I could fake it. And so anyway, I ended up doing a chemistry PhD, but also I no longer had these giant, amazing special purpose computers. So as the only person in history, I went into AI due to a lack of computing. And I said that, I'm going to try and unravel the mystery of proteins with the machine under my desk and some really clever statistical algorithms. And I got very lucky. And then I heard this rumor that DeepMind was getting into this really hard, 50-year grand challenge of protein structure prediction. And maybe I could join them, and it worked out reasonably well.
I think it did. I think it did, but say more a little bit of why you came at this and think about it almost as a physics problem. So say more about that.
So as a physicist, you're taught you're taught to kind of look at the world and come up with simplified facts and models and kind of ways of understanding. And you're taught what I jokingly call applied arrogance, this notion that any problem, if you're really clever about it, physicists like to imagine themselves as the first to get into any new field, right, before it's really described as a field. And
we'll see if Michel agrees with that, but keep going.
Yeah. And so proteins, these things that our DNA tells us, the letters of our DNA, 3 letters at a time say, attach this chemical molecule to this protein. We build these things. It's a machine that only knows how to make one type of joint. Kind of like Legos only have one type of, you just press 2 things together, but we make extraordinary structures out of Legos with the same basic operation. And nature has learned to do the same thing. It encodes a string in DNA, it builds a string of protein, and then it folds up a couple thousand atoms worth into this nanomachine that builds itself. And that is actually the machines that our cells use to do everything we do, right? Out to cognition, right? And so it's this wonderful thing, physicists have loved it forever, that it's about biology, it's about this messy, warm world we live in, but it's also about the wiggling and jiggling of atoms, right? Feynman famously said, everything in nature can be reduced to the wiggling and jiggling of atoms. And so it's this beautiful opportunity where, it gives physicists hope because they can see the atoms, but there's also this really, really clear story of, these extra 3 atoms here mean that you're much more likely to get lung cancer. Why is that the case? There's this connection from the computational world, where I felt like I have some skill, to the atomic world, which I love as a physicist, out to the biological world, which becomes cancer treatments, that becomes that we can understand this. And I love this kind of clear path all the way out to, because of the work we did, I am sure that someone will go home from the hospital that wouldn't otherwise, and I don't know who they'll be, I don't know what disease it will be, but there's this really clear connection from understanding the world of biology to treating disease that is so wonderful.
It's incredible. You mentioned Feynman and wiggling atoms. One of the things that I think you made your breakthroughs kind of decades apart. And back in the 80s, Michel, one of the concepts that came out of your work was this idea of artificial atoms, which has enabled us to actually tackle a whole range of questions, from whether it's the benchmark we use now for quantum computing, random circuit sampling, all the way to some of the algorithms that we've been building, including the ones that run on on Willow, our latest chip. Can you talk a little bit about what's happened, that whole transition from the time you made your breakthroughs to where we are now? How have you seen that progression?
Yes, so the progression was in the quality of the artificial atoms. So to put things in perspective, so at the beginning we were making artificial atoms, but they were of poor quality. So basically, they would lose coherence in 100 oscillations. And now I am very proud of the fact that this field, of course, many people worked on this, but it's now gotten to a factor of 20 million. Like actually our textbook atoms, the hydrogen atoms. So it's essentially 6 orders of magnitude improvement in 40 years, which I feel is quite remarkable. And it is this progress which allows these artificial atoms to build a machine that will compute, hopefully, chemistry problems. I want to say that I'm among very few physicists that love chemistry. I was actually very interested in chemistry in high school, maybe more than in physics. And I hope that the hope is that the machine that we are building will be able to simulate molecules and, in fact, inform artificial intelligence about what it is that makes electron be the glue between atoms, and how does this glue function. So we will provide, in fact, data for actually this structural information that John is
I should actually point out that some of the work you've been doing, so Michel is the chief scientist of our quantum computing hardware, and I think our latest breakthrough, Willow, and it always blows my mind when I think about these benchmarks. So Willow is able to do in less than 5 minutes what would take the world's fastest supercomputer 10 septillion years to do. That's like 1 with 25 zeros, which is extraordinary, which blows my mind. But when you think about that, Michel, where does that lead to? What kinds of useful applications does that take us to?
Well, so there are 2 types of applications, I would say. First, the application of quantum computers in general is they make us more informed about algorithms. So I think this is very important because you may know about Roman numerals and how the Romans were doing computation. It took 2,000 years for humanity to understand really numbers. Try to do a division with Roman numerals. You will see the pain. Well, we are about, when it comes to algorithm, we are more or less at this level. We don't fundamentally understand algorithms, and quantum computers offer us a window into what more general framework should we adopt to view algorithms. So that's I think a very important long-term application of quantum information and quantum computers. But there are also a certain number of problems in optimization, but in quantum chemistry and in quantum sensing that quantum computers can be useful for.
Yeah. And John, I mean, your breakthroughs are more recent compared to Michel. I should actually say you're one of the youngest ever Nobel laureates in
youngest recent. I think I'm like number 25 on the list. I haven't checked or anything.
Okay. But even though your breakthroughs are relatively more recent, a lot has happened since, and some of which you've been involved in as you've gone from AlphaFold 1 to 2 and AlphaFold 3 and some of the other things. How would you describe kind of where we are in really understanding the fundamentals of biology?
At the starting line, I think what we've gotten really exceptional at, I think what's really important to say, is that we got exceptional at this problem of understanding the shape of proteins. And there's universal thing that when we get really, really good at something, we rebuild our world around what got, 6 orders of magnitude better.
Right.
We think of, we got really, really good at reading DNA, and suddenly people came up with all sorts of experiments that end in reading DNA because we've got however many orders of magnitude better at it. I think we're starting to get really good. I think the kind of one of the big legacies of AlphaFold is that it will really enable us to get better at designing drugs once we know what to go after. That it will really tell us, okay, I know that this particular protein I think is going wrong. I want to intervene. I want to design something. And kind of AlphaFold 3, later technologies, design work going on at isomorphic labs and others, and also protein design work, such as what David very well-deserved Nobel for. I think all of this will benefit from this understanding that we will learn how to make a targeted intervention into a cell. And then the really grand problem that we've got coming from that is, okay, now what intervention do you want to do? Right? When you look at a cancer, when you look at a disease like autism, what drug should we go make? Because often it's not just that we know what we want to do. Like famously, there was a protein KRAS that people knew they wanted to drug forever and only recently discovered how to do it. But that's the minority case. The majority case is saying, okay, this patient has this disease. If you could do anything in the cell, what would you do to make them healthy? And it's very hard. It's kind of like when your car doesn't start, you still need a mechanic to say, what part do you replace?
Right.
And I think that is going to be the maybe next frontier in biological AI is how do we better understand the biology of disease? Because, drug discovery really becomes a thing as you make a molecule, you do clinical trials. But before that, it is biology. How do we understand enough biology to figure out a theory of intervention that we can design, and I think we'll be able to design much, much faster because of technologies downstream of AlphaFold and others. But how do we understand disease? And I think that's maybe where we're going to be, certainly we're going to be much more reliant on things like large language models, on scientific reasoning, that it has to entangle, it has to use the whole of the scientific literature to come up with hypotheses and everything we know. And so, maybe I've got Nobelitis, but I'm really excited to work on, Nobelitis is the disease where you get a Nobel and then you think you must be really, really brilliant, so you can only work on very hard problems, and if you're not careful, you do nothing for the rest of your career. But like, how do we get these natural language systems, which are extraordinary, which can read science, but how do we get them to really contribute to our understanding of disease is what I'm currently very interested in.
Well, let me pick up on that notion of understanding, because one of the things, you both work in two areas where the question of understanding is interesting. Quantum mechanics and quantum theory is very difficult, not intuitive to the human mind. So how do we even understand the idea of understanding and science? And John, many have argued that AI is the ultimate black box. Do we actually understand the grammar of proteins, even though AlphaFold can make these predictions? So how do the advances you're working on change the nature of fundamental scientific understanding?
Well, in physics, you have seen a gradual transformation of what it means to understand physics. So in the past, the mathematical model that physics is using was a few equations that you could write on the blackboard with 20 or 30 symbols.
Right.
Now we consider that we understand a physics principle when we can write an algorithm and that computes the solution in polynomial time.
Right.
But yes, this is what I think is understanding. Understanding is about prediction, being able to foresee a phenomenon before you observe it, or to make a machine that really works. I think the success of physics in explaining the world is best, I think, demonstrated by the fact that it helps building machines that eventually really work.
So in other words,
I'm always amazed when I sit in a jumbo jet, which has a weight of 150 tons, and this machine takes off in the air.
So in other words, so you're saying it's no longer going to be about just understanding whether Schrodinger's equation or Navier-Stokes, but actually being able to write algorithms and make predictions.
Yes.
John, would you agree?
I mean, I take the far side of this. I used to work in protein simulation. We would write down the low-level equations of how the atoms interact with each other. We'd watch them bounce against each other for quite literally a trillion steps, and then we would maybe observe something that corresponds to reality. And I think it was the ultimate uninterpretable thing. When you do a trillion steps in a row and you see some shift, you now say, what caused that? And then you go back and you say, well, what if I change this? What if I intervene here? What if I change that? So simulation, AI is uninterpretable in the same way simulation is, in the same way as the fluid dynamics calculations that were used to design that jumbo jet are not interpretable in the way that, people would draw an early flying machine and it would work about the way they drew. But when we have to simulate a jet and then we test it in a wind tunnel, I think understanding is about a human prediction. It's not just prediction, but it requires that it fundamentally fits in your brain so that you can think about new things. And I think we build our understanding around our computational systems, that people understand different classes of proteins because now they say, well, here's 100 proteins from different evolutionary from different parts of the evolutionary tree, and let me run AlphaFold on each of them, and then I can look at the differences. And they build that understanding around black box systems by doing science on it. And actually, in some ways, language models are the most understandable because you can ask for an explanation. You can try and judge its faithfulness. You can't actually ask AlphaFold for an explanation, but what you do have is a really good sense that it is trustworthy because you can prove it by checking on answers you haven't seen. It gives you these confidence metrics that tell you what its expected error of the prediction is. I think understanding is still a process we wrap around our computational systems, but this isn't new.
Well, let's try to bridge this in as we start to get to close this session in the following sense. I mean, our quantum team at Google is actually called the Quantum AI team.
Yes.
And I'd be curious, your vantage point, to what extent is AI help us make progress in quantum computing? And John, for you, will quantum computing have any bearing on how we progress on developing AI algorithms?
Yes, so I really firmly believe that the combination of quantum and AI enables something completely new, which is true chemical engineering. So chemical engineering right now is used to describe the fact that you take a reaction on the lab bench and then you can scale it to a factory. What the promise of this combination of quantum and AI is true chemical engineering in the following sense. So we take a function that we want to realize. For instance, a protein should bind to another protein. And how do you design these molecules? So this is what John just said about molecular design. The promise to enable true design at the chemical level, which is not really possible now.
And John?
I think what I'm most excited about, what we've gotten really, really good at in AI systems in the past year is they're extraordinary at writing code and they're extraordinary at using tools. And we're now building the ultimate tool for understanding chemistry, right? A quantum computer. And I think this notion that we happen to emerge with the right type of reinforcement learning and AI to program really hard to program machines at the same time, and I hope you don't mind me saying this, you make some really hard to program machines, right? And then we have this opportunity to build these synergistic systems where I remember racking my brain about what does quantum plus AI really look like, and you don't really backprop, and the answers that people gave in the literature weren't so convincing, but I think we now have a convincing way to interface these systems and do really new things and explore really exciting avenues. And so I believe it will be, for example, LLM-controlled quantum computers, although maybe it's quantum computer-controlled LLMs, we'll argue that one. But I think it's an exciting time for it.
Yeah, well, maybe let's wrap with this question. I mean, both of you haven't retired yet, even though you got your Nobel Prize. You're still working scientists. What are you working on now?
So personally, I'm working on I'm actually involved in more and more in materials research. Again, going back to chemistry a little bit, so the elements that we are using in these artificial atoms are imperfect, and I believe there's a way to make them even more perfect than they are now.
Fantastic. So you're almost reinventing the Josephson junction, I think, is how you've talked about it.
Yeah.
John, what are you working on now?
Oh, I'm in the thick of building incredible coding agents. And I think both because there's this wonderful, incredible technological change, and Google is leading this, and how do we train these AI systems? And with a thought of, and how am I going to bring these training techniques back to scientific problems? How ultimately are we going to train models like Gemini to be fundamentally great at biology? I think is going to be one of these, defining benefits coming out of this is going to be an incredible understanding. Humans have done exceptional work from where we have come from to understand atoms and life itself, despite none of us have ever seen them. A protein itself is like 100 times smaller than the wavelength of light, right? But I think, our AI systems will ultimately go further.
Maybe we probably have time for just one or two questions. I'm being told we don't. So, all right. So we're gonna skip the questions. I don't see any hands up, so we're gonna skip the questions. So, we do. Yeah, there we go.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Two short ones. One, how much does the breakthroughs in quantum computing lead to questioning encryption in our era and the dangers of that? Two, how many breakthroughs / years are we away from a full understanding of human biology?
Well, small questions.
Okay. So yes, recently it has been shown that actually the breaking of cryptographic codes like RSA or elliptic curves looks much nearer than it was previously assumed. So we might see this in, let's say, 5 years. I hate giving these predictions. It could be 4, it could be 7, but it's really much closer than previously thought, and this is very important because it shows that post-quantum cryptography is absolutely necessary and has to be implemented as fast as possible, even though it might be harder to do than one thinks, but yes.
And John, understanding all of biology?
We have so much to go, right? You should, if you think about the scale of biological discoveries that are still published every week in major journals, we are so far away from even understanding the parts list of the cell. But what I think we will get better and better at is we'll get better at intervening. We'll still have the question of how we do it. We'll get better at understanding disease, but it is fundamentally hard to study a disease that progresses over 10 years, right? No matter, some things can't be parallelized, and so we'll have to depend more and more on understanding and historical data. But I don't, possibly the computers will be doing it instead of me, but I don't anticipate running out of biology in my career.
So I think we'll draw this to a close. Please join me in thanking Michel and John for the extraordinary work they are continuing to do and have done. Thank you. Thank you both. We'll do a handshake.